Hi, this is our pre-reading lecture for our article by Qureshi. We'll be talking about anthropology and the politics of display. So in order to get into these topics, I want to talk a little bit about anthropology and the social sciences broadly as these disciplines that emerge out of Enlightenment and out of this experience of cultural difference that comes from colonization. Then I want to talk about the relationship between the social sciences and governance, and then how anthropology, entertainment, and display all connect. And then I'll offer you some questions to keep in mind as you read Qureshi's article. Okay, so what is anthropology? We might have some anthropologists in the house. So broadly speaking, anthropology is an academic discipline that came to be officially shaped in the 19th century, but has its roots in the 18th century Enlightenment period that we've been taking a look at. And it's a discipline that studies races, cultures, and the evolution of human species. And it's part of this kind of construction of the modern conception of race that we've been looking at as well. Okay, so when anthropology emerges, it is responding to this experience of human difference. So this experience of difference that is happening in the context of colonial contact. So as Western European powers begin to engage and grow their colonial empires around the world, they are experiencing cultures that are different from their own, and are seeking to, with this very Enlightenment spirit, sort of categorize and make sense of these differences. And when we're thinking about colonial contact, we want to keep in mind the power dynamic between a colonizing or conquering power and a colonized people. Okay, so there are two branches of anthropology that are part of the conversation that comes up in our article by Qureshi. The first is ethnology, and that's a branch of anthropology that uses a comparative approach. So if I was doing an ethnological study, I would use my home culture as the basis for comparison. And when the home culture is the culture of the colonizer, who is seeking to prove that the colonized people are inferior, we can see how this comparative approach isn't really leading towards cultural knowledge, but leading towards a conclusion about who's better. Okay, and then physiognomy is another branch that is more focused on outward appearance. So it links physical characteristics to something about someone's interior life or in their character. So someone who believes in physiognomy might look at my face and say, oh, she's got the brow of a criminal and the nose of a liar, something like that, right? So this supposition that something about our physique, our bone structure, our facial structure is linked to something about our interior character is part of that. Okay. Oh, and this is just an image that was an attempt to document all the noses of England in these physiognomical studies to figure out what do the noses of England mean. Okay, so anthropology as a scholarly pursuit that comes out of the Enlightenment, we want to sort of keep in mind all the stuff that we talked about in our previous weeks, this valuation of progress and this desire to categorize all knowledge, and this belief in empiricism as well are still kind of part of the development of the social sciences and anthropology more specifically. So as we see with the Enlightenment, we have this kind of contradiction that comes to the fore, that there is this commitment to these ideas of natural rights, these ideas of citizenship and equality. But then, as we see happening in the United States and with the growth of Western European colonial conquests, we have the sense that there is a desire to be committed to equality while also desiring to have an excuse to maintain the racial inequality upon which colonial economies and the American economy were premised. So how do we excuse that, essentially? So what we see happening is that thinkers and lawmakers are turning towards this much more established field of ethnology as we are seeing take shape. And they're using this new field in order to affirm the exclusion of people of color from these conversations around natural rights and around equality. So essentially, we can think about how in the 19th century, the kind of quote-unquote science that Jefferson was doing is becoming more codified, more official, and more reputable and respected as a kind of tool that gives authority to these kinds of exclusionary practices that are part of building either a racist colonial state or a government and economy premised on the institution of slavery. Okay, so when we're thinking about ethnology in action, I wanted to give two examples from the American context. So the first is from Andrew Jackson's presidency, and it's about this change in the approach to dealings with Native American tribes and communities in the United States. So prior to 1830, there had been an assimilationist approach taken to relationships with Native Americans. So what does assimilationist mean? We talked a little bit about this last week, but it's about the adoption of American customs, or white American customs and culture and language and religion and schooling. And so there was this idea that white Americans and Native Americans could live well together if Native Americans would adopt white cultural practices, right? So that's a problematic approach in and of itself. But what we see happening in 1830 is this declaration that white Americans and Native Americans could no longer coexist next to each other, and therefore it became legally viable to remove Native Americans with the Indian Removal Act of 1830. So this reversed a major Supreme Court decision that had protected a Cherokee claim to land in Georgia. So this change in approach and this change in understanding of cultural difference and what it means results in the Trail of Tears that we may be familiar with from American history classes. So this march of the Cherokee people out of Georgia and into Oklahoma that resulted in the massive death and deprivement of the Cherokee people. And this kind of pattern of disenfranchisement of Native Americans from both their own land and from the political process is very much part of the 21st century experience of Native Americans in the United States as well. We may be familiar with what happened in North Dakota as the Dakota Pipeline was going to pass through environmentally and spiritually significant land of Native peoples in North Dakota. And so there was a massive protest that was responded to with great vigorous opposition and violence. And as of last month, actually, construction of the pipeline has been stopped thanks to the continued activism of Native American lawyers and activists who are pushing against this construction as a kind of declaration of their sovereignty and their right to have their land not be used in a way that they don't agree with. Okay, so the other example that we want to take a look at is the case of Dred Scott that we may be familiar with as well. So we are seeing this individual, Dred Scott, who is suing for the freedom of himself and his family after the person who enslaved him had died. So when the person who enslaved Dred Scott and his family passed away, he cited this law that essentially says that if the person who enslaved you dies while you are in a free state, you become free. And so the St. Louis court found in favor of the Scott family, suggesting that yes, they have the right to gain their freedom. The family of the enslaver appealed the decision to the Missouri Supreme Court, who decided in favor of the enslaver's family. And so we have a series of appeals that takes the decision all the way up to the Supreme Court. So in 1857, this major decision is come to by the Supreme Court that would impact not only Scott, but the history of the African American community more broadly. So the decision declared that Scott, as an African American person, was not a citizen, right? So this decision was really broad, not just applying to the case at hand, but declared that he was not a citizen, and so therefore he had no right to even use the courts in the first place. And while they were at it, this very wide-acting court also suggested that Congress could not outlaw slavery in the states at all. That wasn't the power of Congress. Again, sort of pointing to that idea of states' rights. So this decision impacted not only Scott and his family, but it was a denial of citizenship to all African Americans, free or enslaved. And so what we see happening with the Dred Scott decision is that inherent contradiction in this doctrine of equality that we talked about last time was sort of formalized. So it was clearly stated that African American individuals are not part of what is meant when these documents refer to equal protection under the law, equality, freedom, private property, etc., right? So what's interesting from our perspective, too, is that the Supreme Court uses ethnological research to support their decision. So in writing their decision, right, the Supreme Court is required to, look at all the proof and talk about what swayed them towards their decision to justify what they ended up deciding. And so they are referring to ethnological research that supports their decision, stating the inferiority of African Americans that justifies the denial of any rights, right? So this kind of dubious form of social scientific research is giving credence to this really impactful and devastating decision that stripped individuals of their access to the rights of citizenship, regardless of their status as free or enslaved. So this decision in many ways leads to the outbreak of the Civil War. And as we know, this kind of idea that African American individuals don't have a right to use the legal system has intergenerational impacts, right? The justice system still has a super long way to go before it can be said that it treats everybody equally regardless of their racial identity. Okay, so those are two examples of ethnology in action, of how it impacts the rights and privileges of individuals here in the United States. Okay, so as we know, and as we talked about last week, race is a social construct. It's not biological. That means it changes all the time, what racial categories refer to, how they work, what they mean, this sense that right race is an idea, it's not a fact. So what this means and what's important for us is that race doesn't need this kind of backing of science to operate in society, right? A lot of the science that we're talking about, and a lot of the social science that we're talking about is not reputable science from the perspective of today's understanding of what scientific research is, but the historical associations of ethnological and biological research complicate this construct of race and has given it a lot of power over time to have these significant intergenerational impacts. Okay, so with that in mind, we are thinking about how anthropology and ethnology are not only part of the kind of legal and statecraft, state-making processes in the 19th century, but they're also part of an entertainment and museum culture that is developing in the 19th century as well. So when we're thinking about anthropology and ethnology, the way that they displayed their research to the broader public was through collections. So a collection is supposed to operate as a stand-in between the viewer and the culture that the collected object comes from. So the representational kind of power of the collection is to represent an entire culture through a set of objects, or in the case that we'll talk about, an individual from this culture as well. So these new display contexts, whether it's museums or entertainment, are still reflecting these colonial power dynamics, and that's something that we'll talk about and trace as we take a look at Saidiya Qureshi's article. So what we're thinking about here, we don't really think of the sciences and entertainment being explicitly linked, but in the 19th century, these kinds of strict disciplinary decides, as we saw with the defecating duck, that was both science and entertainment as well, that continues to be rather porous in the 19th century. So anthropology and ethnology are part of this kind of growth of a mass entertainment industry that's happening in the 19th century. So the ways that culture is being displayed in this era is at natural history museums, World's Fairs, and then, as we'll read about in our article, we see displays of individuals from colonial holdings becoming a really popular form of cheap entertainment in places like London, places like Paris as well. So these world fairs are something that we'll talk about a little bit more extensively when we get together. But essentially, the World's Fair is a way for a country to brag about itself, and it's also a way for a country to remind everybody that they're better than everybody else, right? Okay. So these are just a few questions to keep in mind as you're reading, asking you to think about what was going on and paying attention to the different contexts in which Bartman was displayed. So connecting what we just talked about today with Bartman's specific experience. Okay, I will see all of you in our Zoom meeting. Take care.